joining us to try and make some sense of it all, where it's all going to go, what the position of New Zealand might be, and whether or not it's going to influence the international environment any more than it has, and also to give us some update on what's happening with the United Nations and why the US is finding itself so unpopular, particularly around Gaza, is Professor Stephen Hoadley, Associate Professor Stephen Hoadley from Auckland University, the Honorary Academic of Political and International Relations there. Professor Hoadley, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Michael.
First of all, a little bit about yourself. I didn't realise you served in the US Navy.
Yes, U.S. Navy. I'm also an honorary captain in the New Zealand Navy. So,
What did you do in the US Navy?
I was an operations officer. I was on a ship. We toured around the Far East. We showed the flag. We took photographs of Chinese vessels that might be hostile or suspect, and generally maintained the U.S. presence in that part of the world.
And then you left, obviously, the Navy, studied political science in California, got yourself a doctorate, and came to New Zealand, what? Must be about 50 years ago. That's
correct. Just over 50 years ago, I met a very nice woman to whom I'm still married. And
good on you.
She happened to be from New Zealand, and she said, let's give it a try. And I said, yeah, I'll give it a try. And I'm still here.
Good on you. All right, so you will have some intimate understanding of the US military, obviously, and you have, obviously, that's your professional and academic interest as well, defence, international relations and things. As I said, 2 years ago, Russia marched into Ukraine thinking, I think, it was going to be all over by, well, a very short period of time. I think they brought their dress uniforms with them, the initial invading forces, because they thought there'd be some sort of ceremony in Kiev relatively quickly. 2 years later, we're where we are. The latest news coming from the front line is that a battle has been lost, and that the Russians, despite enormous losses of men and personnel, are making some small advance. But there are also real morale issues in the Ukrainian forces and questions as to whether or not the West is going to hold the line. What's your perspective of it all 2 years on, Stephen?
Well, I think your summing up was quite adequate. I can only add a few footnotes and details insofar as the Ukrainian personnel are, well, the population is 1/3 of that of Russia, so the Russians, man for man, can eventually outlast the Ukrainians in a battle of attrition. So you're quite right, the Ukrainians are feeling the loss of skilled soldiers, of people who can operate Western equipment, and that Western equipment is not really coming online quickly enough. Simple things like artillery shells, more complex things like drones and surface-to-air missiles to protect the Ukrainians from the onslaught by Russia. So the Russians can, meter by meter, by sacrificing hundreds of their own troops, now recruited from Siberia and the back blocks of Russia, and even as far away as Nepal. The Nepalese are signing up because the benefits to a soldier in Russia are substantial, well, compared to the possibilities of gaining full employment in Nepal. And they are being sent straight to the front line from the prisons of Russia, and they're being killed in great numbers, but the next wave continues to come forward, and the Ukrainians are, as you point out, step by step being forced back. How long this can continue depends a lot on a group of representatives in the House of Representatives of the United States, so-called Freedom Caucus. It is a bunch of nutters who adhere to Donald Trump, who feel that the Mexican border is more important than détente and deterrence in international affairs, and they're holding up a $50 billion aid package that could provide Ukraine with basic military material, not only artillery shells, but also missiles, also backup for their government expenses. And it's a scandal, in my view, that Mike Johnson, the leader of the House of Representatives, called a 2-week recess for no particular reason except to stop debate and to delay any kind of action on this vital bill that is now stalled in the House of Representatives.
I studied University American history when I was at university a long time ago. And one of the things I appreciated, Stephen, was that you've always had a very strong isolationist lobby in your country. It goes back to the 19th century. So I'm assuming that House of Representatives Republican freedom lobby that you've discussed is part of that isolationist tradition.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, Michael. Of course, it's new people, new ideas, new terminology, but the feeling is still the same, that the United States is self-sufficient. It does not need allies if they're troublesome and take American money without saying thank you, that the United States should focus on its own industry, fixing up its own potholes, drilling for its own oil, manufacturing its own goods and selling them to its own consumers. And there's a feeling that somehow the United States doesn't need the rest of the world. Hey, you're right. It goes back Charles Lindbergh. Strangely enough, since he was an international aviator, but he was one of the leaders of the isolationist group, pro-Germany during the Nazi period. John F. Kennedy's father was pro-Nazi, met Ribbentrop and other Nazi figures. The Congress refused to support Franklin Roosevelt when he wanted to give aid to Great Britain as the German armies advanced across Europe. So you're right, there is this feeling, particularly in the Midwest, maybe not so much in the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast states. People are pretty clued up, pretty international there. But in the Midwestern states, the so-called flyover states, the states that most people would never actually see because they'll fly from Los Angeles to New York, and down below is the great heartland of America, the moral majority, and they're the ones who are isolationists, who feel make America great again, support self-sufficiency. So, you're quite right. It is a battle of ideologies and maybe a replay, as you say, of historical debates.
Well, the other thing that strikes me about the Russians, I have to say, is, and also I studied Russian history as well, is that they've never really, in actual fact, even from Tsarist times, had any other view than that the West is a threat. So they've never really sought to embrace the West or Western values, and they've always seen themselves as being surrounded potentially by enemies and sought to create buffer states, obviously, for that. But when they fight a war, Stephen, loss doesn't seem to affect Russians in quite the same way that they affect the West. So they know that they can expend vast numbers of people and get away with it. Why do the Russian people, do you think, put up with that?
Well, that's a question that we always ask, but we don't have good polling information. We don't have good election information. As you point out, it's not a democracy. And we're always puzzled. We know that the leaders can be hyper-nationalistic. They can be Russian, as you say. But the people are, we say, perhaps suppressed. We know that, well, just take a very small example in today's newspaper. A bullet-ridden body was found in Spain. It turned out to be a Russian helicopter pilot who defected to Ukraine, and he then took his $500,000 reward and went to Spain to live happily ever after, and Russian assassins have found him and killed him. Stalin sent an assassin as far away as Mexico City to assassinate his rival Trotsky. So if I were a Russian, I'd be very careful what I said in public. I'm just amazed at those brave people who have laid flowers at various Gulag victim monuments around Russia, not only in Moscow, who are now recorded by the FSB photographers. They are at risk. 400 have been arrested for doing nothing more than indicating very indirectly some support for Navalny, the just recently murdered.
Nevertheless, Stephen, I know, I understand you're expressing a sort of, typical, and I'm not criticising you for this at all, but a sort of typical Western liberal outrage that, these sorts of things this sort of injustice can be manifest in the 21st century. But it seems to me, from my perspective anyhow, that in actual fact Russia has significant political support